The most powerful man in the city was dying in his own bedroom, and he could hear the vultures laughing in the hall. The air in the penthouse smelled of expensive lilies and the cold rot of betrayal. Kwan Do-Hyum was not in a hospital. Officially, it was about security. A man of his reputation could not risk a public ward where rivals could slip past the guards. Unofficially, home was a tomb that was easier to manage. No outside eyes. No second opinions. At 29, Do-Hyum was a myth of the underworld. He had broken markets and walked through fire that would have turned other men to ash. They called him the frozen dragon. Now his body was in a cage. He lay there, mind screaming, while his stepmother Cho Yan-hee stood at the foot of the bed. She wore a cream blazer and scrolled through her phone as if she were picking a restaurant for lunch. The neurologist gave his verdict without even leaning in. Full psychosomatic paralysis. He is gone. Yan-hee didn't check his pulse. She checked her reflection in the glass of his heart monitor. The board is ready, she said. Transfer the proxy rights by Friday. The lawyer checked his watch. Make it Thursday. That was how kings were murdered. Not with lead but with ink. To them, the throne was already a pile of wood. On the floor, a woman in a gray uniform moved her caregiver cloth in slow, rhythmic circles. Docas remained head bowed, a shadow among the furniture. She was the only one who saw the reflection in the polished wood, a deep, bruised purple mark at the base of Do-Hyun's skull. She watched the rhythm of the foredrip. It wasn't the pace of a dying man. It was the rhythm of a man being buried alive under chemicals. Docas didn't hesitate. She slid a 4-inch needle from her hair. The metal caught the light of the chandelier like a blade of ancient justice. While the family debated the font for a funeral program, Docas was calculating the angle of his salvation. We do not just watch these stories. We honor the iron will of those the world tries to bury. The silence of the room was heavy, thick with the arrogance of those who believed they had already won. Inside the cage of his stillness, Kwan Do-Hyum watched as the people who carried his name treated his life like a bothersome detail in a ledger. They were men of science and paperwork, convinced that what they could not measure did not exist. But on the marble floor, Docas moved with a purpose they were too proud to notice. She was a caregiver, a woman whose hands held the memory of an older world, and she knew that science had not failed the man in the bed. It had been weaponized against him. She waited until the room cleared of its vultures, until the only sound was the indifferent beep of monitors and the relentless rain against the glass. Moving to the bedside, she did not look at the charts or the expensive displays. She looked at the man. She leaned over him, her presence a sudden warm weight in the cold sterility of the suite. "My name is Docas," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the dark. "I know you are running out of time because the people in this building are not waiting for a miracle. They are waiting for a window." She did not use the cold steel of the hospital. She used the traditional touch passed down through generations of healers in Enugu. She began to sing, a low, resonant melody in a language that carried the authority of the earth itself. It was a song of restoration, a call to the spirit to reclaim the flesh. Her fingers, practiced and precise, found the base of his skull where the suppressed nerves lay dormant beneath that deep, bruised purple mark. As the song rose, she drew the golden needle, its metal catching the amber light with a glow that belonged to things used with sacred intention. She positioned it at the junction where the spine met the brain stem, the exact point where the body's command had been severed. With a focus that saw past the skin and into the living architecture of his soul, she drove the metal home. The room did not shake, but the silence broke as Do-Hyun's lungs, starved for 4 months, opened with a sound like a man breaking the surface of deep water. In that moment, where modern science had signed a death warrant, an ancient song and a caregiver's hand had declared a resurrection. The silence in the penthouse was a heavy, suffocating weight, broken only by the indifferent rhythm of a monitor that seemed to count down the final hours of a legend. Kwan Do-Hyum lay beneath the expensive linens, a man whose empire had been built on iron and blood, now reduced to a statue in a room that smelled of fresh lilies and the cold rot of quiet betrayal. His family and his lawyers moved around him with the measured efficiency of undertakers, debating the transfer of proxy rights while the throne was still warm. They saw a man who was already erased, a body waiting for a burial program, but they did not see the caregiver who stood in the shadows with the knowledge of an older world. Docas did not look at the heart monitor or the charts that science had used to sign a death warrant. She moved to the bedside with a steady, quiet authority, her presence a sudden warmth in the clinical chill of the suite. The rain pressed its gray weight against the high windows as she reached into her midnight silk pouch and drew out the golden needle, its metal catching the chandelier light with a glow that belonged to generations of healers. She knew the clock was ticking, that the people in this building were not waiting for a miracle, but for a window to finalize their heist. She positioned the needle at the precise junction where the spine met the brain stem, the exact pressure point her grandmother had taught her in a village in Enugu. With the focus of someone calculating the weight of a soul, she drove the metal home. There was no dramatic sound, only the sudden violent intake of air as Do-Hyun's lungs, starved for air for 4 long months, opened with the sound of a man breaking the surface of water after being held under. Then the world shifted. In the center of that stubborn silence, his right hand came up from the sheets and caught her wrist. It was not the grip of a sick man. It was firm, alive, and unwilling to let go. The first movement of a king reclaiming a life that the world had already written off. His fingers locked around her skin, letting the strength return to his frame as his eyes, standing right up against the glass of his own mind, looked out at her with a controlled fire. In that half-second of recognition, the invisible caregiver and the untouchable boss formed a silent agreement. The cage had a crack in it, and for the first time in months, the man trapped inside was finally awake. Do-Hyun was reclaiming his throne from the edge of the grave, but his victory was met with a chorus of terror. As Kwan Do-Hyun's fingers locked around the wrist of the woman who had saved him, the air in the penthouse shattered. The betrayal that had once been quiet and clinical suddenly became loud and frantic. The family, caught in the middle of a legal execution, did not see a miracle. They saw the end of their ambitions, and they reacted with the desperation of cornered animals. Cho Yan-hee was the first to find her voice, her face contorting into a mask of righteous horror. "Witch!" she screamed, her finger trembling as she pointed at the caregiver who stood with a steady, ancient authority. "She used sorcery. She's bewitching him." The cry was taken up by the others in the room, the lawyers and the executives who had already spent the boss's fortune in their minds. Fear spread through the suite faster than gratitude, a calculated hysteria designed to bury the truth before it could speak. They didn't want to explain why the doctors had failed or why the foredrip had been weaponized. They wanted to erase the witness. Docas did not move. She stood with the quiet strength of someone who had already made peace with the consequences of her courage. She looked at the men who were now advancing on her, their faces twisted by a manufactured panic. "She's a sorcerer," Director Beck roared, his voice cracking as he signaled for the security detail. "She's done something unnatural to the chairman. Get her out of here before she kills us all." They moved in not to protect the man in the bed, but to hide the crime that sat at the base of his skull. In the chaos, they ignored the fire returning to Do-Hyun's eyes. They dragged Docas away from the bedside, her gray uniform a sharp contrast to the expensive suits of the men who handled her like refuse. She didn't plead for her life, but her eyes never left the man she had pulled back from the dark. Even as they forced her toward the door, accusing her of dark arts to mask their own black hearts, the room felt the shift in power. The family thought they were casting out a witch, but they were actually throwing away the only person who had remained loyal in a house built on lies. The king was awake, and as the doors closed on his savior, the silence that followed was far more dangerous than the accusations they had screamed. The rain fell heavily that night, the kind that blurred truth and lies. Docas was not merely escorted from the penthouse, she was discarded like a broken tool. The men who had spent weeks ignoring her presence now handled her with a rough, panicked energy, their expensive suits shielding them from the cold reality of their own cowardice. There was no settlement, no final paycheck, and no dignity in the way they forced her toward the service elevator. They had already labeled her a witch to mask the blackness of their own hearts, and in their world, a label was more powerful than the truth. The heavy doors of the mansion ground shut behind her, the sound of final, iron period at the end of her service. She stood on the wet asphalt of the driveway, soaked and trembling, clutching a single small bag that held the remains of her life and soul. The high-priced lights of Seoul Heights blurred above her, distant and indifferent to the injustice occurring in their shadow. She had pulled a king back from the dark, and for her courage she was rewarded with the biting wind and the accusations of those who had wanted him dead. She began to walk, her footsteps absorbed by the relentless drumming of the storm. She didn't look back at the windows where she had spent 11 months being invisible. Behind her, inside that fortress of marble and quiet betrayal, she knew Kwan Do-Hyum was waking up to a house full of vultures, but she could no longer protect him. She was a woman alone in a foreign city, her dignity stripped away by people who treated her like furniture until she became a threat to their greed. As she reached the iron gates, her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp, invasive sound against the rhythm of the rain. She pulled it out with numb fingers. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Stay silent about what happened, or your past will be exposed." Her breath caught, the cold air lunging into her chest. She had thought the nightmare was ending, but fear had already taken root in a new and darker soil. She whispered to herself, "I didn't do anything wrong," but the storm offered no absolution. She walked into the gray weight of the night, a savior cast into the mud, unaware that the man she had healed was already looking for his sword. Do-Hyum sat upright in a bed that had almost become his casket, his presence filling the room with a cold, sudden authority that the vultures in the hall never anticipated. The air in the penthouse still carried the faint scent of fresh lilies and the lingering rot of the family's quiet betrayal, but the silence was now a different kind of weapon. Kwan Do-Hyum was no longer the legend trapped inside a frozen body. He was a man who had broken the surface of a deep, dark water and was now looking for his iron. His eyes, once fixed and glassy, now burned with a controlled fire as they swept across the faces of the lawyers and executives who had come to witness his erasure. He ignored the frantic beeping of the monitors and the panicked voices of the medical staff who had been paid to keep him quiet. He didn't look at the incapacitation papers or the board-appointed physicians who had already signed his death warrant. He looked only at the empty space where the caregiver had stood, the woman who had used an older authority to call him back from the grave. His lungs, drawing the first real oxygen in 4 months, felt like a current moving through him, and when he finally broke the silence, his voice carried the texture of a king reclaiming his kingdom. "Where is she?" The question was a blade, sharp and absolute, cutting through the manufactured grief of his stepmother and the stuttering excuses of Director Beck. The room went still, the kind of quiet that exists only before something irreversible occurs. Cho Yan-hee clutched her cream blazer, her eyes darting toward the door as if she could still smell the rain from the storm where they had discarded his savior. No one answered him at first, their arrogance replaced by the realization of an enormous miscalculation. Do-Hyum slowly rose from the bed despite the warnings of the monitors, his posture carrying the quiet uprightness of a man who had remembered at great cost how to stand in his own body. He looked at the traitors who had treated him like furniture and realized they had stolen the only person who had remained loyal. "Bring me the woman who saved me," he demanded, the command echoing through the marble halls of Seoul Heights with a cold, dangerous intent. The performance of his death was over. The resurrection had begun, and those who had cast Docas into the storm were about to find out that the king was not in a mood to be gracious. Kwan Do-Hyum stood at the center of a boardroom that had become a den of thieves, his presence a cold, absolute weight that the room's architecture could barely contain. The air in Seoul Heights still carried the scent of fresh lilies, but the quiet betrayal that had once filled the penthouse was now a loud, frantic hum of excuses. Kwan Do-Hyum did not look at the incapacitation papers or the board members who had already planned his funeral. He looked at the empty space where a caregiver in a gray uniform should have been. He was a man who had walked through fire and survived assassins, but the realization that his only loyal ally had been erased by his own family left him more shaken than any physical wound. He ignored the legal documents and the stuttering apologies of the men who had treated him like furniture while he lay frozen. His eyes, burning with a controlled fire, moved to the marble floor where Docas had once moved in slow, rhythmic circles, invisible to everyone but the man she was calling back from the dark. He remembered the warmth of her hand and the older authority of the song she had used to break the cage of his stillness. Now the throne was indeed empty, not because he was dying, but because the people in this room had discarded the woman who had decided the king was not done breathing. "You threw her out," Do-Hyum said, his voice carrying the texture of iron and a dangerous, quiet intent. The performance of his death was over, and the resurrection was demanding an accounting that no one in the room was prepared to pay. He looked at Cho Yan-hee, who clutched her cream blazer as if it could shield her from the storm he was about to unleash. She had checked her reflection in his heart monitor while he was helpless, but now she was forced to look into the eyes of a man who understood exactly how close he had come to disappearing. The realization was a blade, sharp and absolute. They had not just exiled a caregiver. They had thrown away his savior into a storm with nothing but a small bag and a blackmail threat. Do-Hyun slowly rose to his full height, the slight hitch in his left foot a secret he would use to hunt down every person who had touched her. He turned away from the black lacquer table and the useless paperwork, his mind already calculating the angles of a search that would not stop until he found her. The boardroom was a tomb of their own making, and as he walked toward the door, the silence he left behind was a promise of a reckoning that would be as irreversible as the act of saving his life. The rain continued to fall with a relentless, heavy weight, washing away the traces of the woman who had just performed a miracle. Docas sat on a cold metal bench at the Seoul Express bus terminal, a solitary figure amidst the midnight travelers who moved with the indifference of people who still had homes to go to. The air in the station was thick with the scent of damp wool and industrial cleaner, a harsh contrast to the expensive lilies that had filled the penthouse of her betrayal. She clutched a small worn bag to her chest, everything she had left of her life in this city. Inside were the silk pouch, the golden needle, and the memories of a grandmother whose ancient authority was the only thing that had never lied to her. She was no longer the caregiver in the gray uniform. She was a woman without a name, a savior cast into the mud by those who feared the light she had brought into their dark house. Her mind moved in rhythmic circles, much like her cleaning cloth had as she calculated the arithmetic of her survival. She had pulled a king back from the grave, but in the eyes of his family, she was merely furniture to be discarded when it became inconvenient. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had felt the first twitch of life in Kwan Do-Hyun's frozen body, and felt the sharp sting of an injustice that science could not measure. Every few minutes her phone would vibrate in her pocket, a persistent reminder that the vultures were still circling. The anonymous messages remained the same, promising exposure and ruin if she dared to speak the truth. She closed her eyes, trying to find the steady anchor of the song she had used to call him back, but the station's intercom drowned out the melody of her heritage. She was a stranger in a foreign land, wired home to her mother every second Friday, now running from a debt she didn't owe to people who didn't understand the language of her soul. As the bus for a distant, nameless city pulled into the bay, Docas stood with a quiet, upright dignity that no accusation could strip away. She didn't look at the high windows of Seoul Heights that stood like cold sentinels against the sky. She boarded the bus, taking a seat in the back where the shadows were deepest, and watched the city lights blur into a gray, unrecognizable smear against the glass. She had left the king awake in a house of traitors, and as the bus pulled away she realized that the greatest needle in her story was not made of gold, but of the decision to keep moving even when the world had already buried her. The rain continued its relentless assault on the city, a cold, gray weight that seemed determined to wash away the memory of the miracle Docas had performed. She sat in the back of the bus, her small bag clutched against her chest like a shield, watching the lights of Seoul blur into unrecognizable smears against the glass. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wool and old fatigue, a world far removed from the sterile treachery of the penthouse. She had pulled a king back from the brink of erasure, and for her courage she had been cast out into the mud. The silence of her departure was broken by the sharp, invasive buzz of her phone. It was a sound that carried a different kind of authority, not the ancient, healing warmth of her song, but the cold, clinical rhythm of a threat. She pulled the device from her pocket with fingers that were still numb from the storm. The screen lit up, a harsh blue glare in the shadows of the bus, revealing a message from an unknown number. "Stay silent about what happened at Seoul Heights," the text read, its words landing with the precision of a deliberate blow. "Or your past will be exposed. We are watching." Docas felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been struck. She looked out the window, searching the dark reflections for a face she didn't know, a shadow that didn't belong. The family hadn't just thrown her out, they had laid a trap for her silence. They knew she was the only witness to the bruised purple mark of their crime, and they intended to bury her voice before it could reach the man she had saved. A cold, absolute fear took root in her chest, but beneath it, a spark of the old iron remained. She had spent her life being invisible, a woman whose survival was wired home to Enugu every second Friday, but she was not a coward. She whispered to herself, "I did nothing wrong," though the darkness pressing against the glass offered no comfort. She realized then that her exile was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a hunt. The people who had planned the murder of Kwan Do-Hyum were now turning their sights on her. As the bus pulled further into the nameless night, Docas understood that the truth she carried was more dangerous than the golden needle she had used to save a life, and the shadow at her door was only just beginning to close in. The atmosphere in the penthouse was no longer thick with the quiet rot of betrayal. It was charged with the electric tension of a coming storm. Kwan Do-Hyum sat on the edge of the bed that had nearly become his tomb, his presence filling the room with a cold, absolute authority that rendered the high-priced medical equipment obsolete. He was no longer the frozen legend trapped within his own skin. He was a man who had broken the surface of a deep, dark water, and the fire in his eyes told everyone in the room that the era of their quiet treachery was over. The neurologist stepped forward, his face pale as he stammered about medical protocols and the danger of sudden movement. Do-Hyum didn't look at him. He stood up, his posture carrying the quiet, upright strength of a man who had remembered how to stand in his own body. When his feet hit the marble floor, the sound carried the weight of a king reclaiming a stolen kingdom. He shoved aside the monitors, the wires falling away like useless threads. Director Beck tried to reach for his arm, his voice a frantic hum of false concern, but Do-Hyun's gaze turned him to ash where he stood. There was no hesitation, no weakness. Only the iron will of a man who had returned from a place they had sent him to die. "Step back," Do-Hyum commanded, his voice carrying the texture of a blade being drawn. He looked at Cho Yan-hee, who clutched her cream blazer as if it could shield her from the truth. She had checked her reflection in his heart monitor while he was helpless, but now she was forced to look into the eyes of a man who understood the full depth of her ambition. The betrayal was no longer a secret whispered in the halls. It was a living thing in the room, and Do-Hyum was the judge. He walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, the slight hitch in his left foot the only evidence of the months he had spent in the dark. He looked out at the rainy Seoul skyline, not as a victim, but as a hunter who had finally identified the scent of his enemies. They had called her a witch to cover their crimes, but he knew the truth. They had thrown out his savior, and in doing so, they had lit a fire that would burn their house to the ground. He turned back to the room, his focus narrowing with a dangerous, quiet intent. The performance of his death was finished. The resurrection was complete, and the reckoning he was about to unleash would be as irreversible as the act of saving his life. He would not stop until he found the woman with the golden needle, and God help anyone who stood in the way of his path. Kwan Do-Hyum sat in the high-backed leather chair of his private study, the northern sweep of the Seoul skyline bleeding into a gray, rain-streaked blur outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was no longer the frozen figure trapped in a bed of quiet betrayal. He was a man who had reclaimed his heartbeat and his iron. But the penthouse felt like a hollow shell. Every time he looked at the marble floor, he saw the phantom circles of a cleaning cloth and the shadow of a woman the world had deemed invisible. Across from him, a team of specialized investigators worked in a silence so thick it carried its own weight. These were men who traded in the difficult and the hidden, experts at finding those who did not wish to be found. "There is nothing, Chairman," the lead investigator said, his voice measured and thin. "We have scoured the National Immigration Database. We've audited the work visa registries and the temporary residency logs for the last 3 years. There is no record of a woman named Docas matching her description entering the country through any official channel." Do-Hyum didn't move. He watched the rain strike the glass with the rhythmic intensity of a heartbeat. "Then you are looking for a name she was given, not the name she owns," he said, his voice carrying the texture of cold stone. "She is a ghost to your systems because your systems were built to ignore people like her. She worked in my house for 11 months. She moved through the corridors of Seoul Heights like a whisper. Someone saw her. Someone stamped a paper. We checked the housekeeping logs provided by Director Beck's team before his arrest," the investigator continued, hesitant. "The entries were scrubbed. She was listed only as a daily contractor from an agency that went bankrupt 2 weeks ago. No tax ID, no insurance file. It's as if she was erased the moment she was cast out." Do-Hyum leaned forward, the controlled fire in his eyes narrowing. The realization was a sharp, absolute blade. The family hadn't just thrown her into the storm. They had attempted to delete her existence to ensure she could never testify to the bruised purple mark they had left on his soul. "She is not a ghost," Do-Hyum commanded, his posture possessing a quiet, upright authority. She is a living person who wired her survival home to Enugu every second Friday. If the immigration records are empty, look at the unofficial paths. Look at the people who live in the margins. I want every shadow in this city turned over. I will not sit on a throne built by a savior I cannot find. The hunt was no longer about data. It was about a debt of blood and breath, and he would burn every ledger in the city to find her. The rain had not stopped. It had simply moved with her, a cold and relentless companion as she journeyed away from the fortress of Seoul Heights. Deby sat in the dim light of a cramped bathroom in a coastal transit station, the air thick with the scent of harsh lye and old salt. She looked into the cracked mirror, not with the vanity of the family she had left behind, but with the cold, absolute necessity of a soldier preparing for a new front. In her hand she held a pair of industrial shears she had purchased with the last of her coins. With a steady hand she began to cut. The long braids that had carried the golden needle fell to the tiled floor like discarded chains. She watched her reflection change, the person who had been a witness to a king's betrayal disappearing into the shadows of the room. She was no longer Docas, the caregiver who sang the songs of Enugu to a frozen man. That woman had been cast into the storm and buried by the lies of a powerful family. To survive the hunt that was closing in, she needed to become someone the ledgers could not find. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn, forged identification card she had acquired months ago as a precaution for a day she hoped would never arrive. She stared at the name printed on the faded plastic. Deby. It was a short, sharp name, a name that carried no history and invited no questions. She whispered it to herself, her voice a quiet anchor in the hollow silence of the station. Deby. The sound was unfamiliar, but it was the only shield she had left against the blackmailers and the hunters who were surely turning over every stone in Seoul. She packed her remaining belongings, the silk pouch hidden deep beneath a layer of civilian clothes, and stepped back out into the gray weight of the morning. The world saw a different woman now, someone smaller, quieter, a face in the crowd that no one would remember. She had successfully erased the savior to protect the woman. As she boarded a bus heading toward a nameless care home in a distant city, Deby looked out at the blurring landscape with a controlled fire in her eyes. The name was new, but the iron in her soul remained. She was moving into a world of silence and caution, unaware that while she was busy burying her past, Kwan Do-Hyum was already setting the world on fire to exhume it. Kwan Do-Hyum stood in the center of the penthouse, the sprawling skyline of Seoul visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass like a cold, electric kingdom. The air in the room no longer smelled of lilies or betrayal. It was thick with the heavy, pressurized silence of a coming storm. He was a man who had reclaimed his own heartbeat, yet the house felt like a tomb because the only soul who had been loyal was gone. He looked at the circle of his high-ranking lieutenants, men who had built empires on violence and absolute obedience, and saw the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. They had spent months following the orders of traitors, and now they stood before a legend who had returned from the dead with a thirst for a different kind of justice. He moved to the black lacquer table, his posture carrying the quiet, upright authority of a king who has finished asking and has started deciding. He didn't look at the files or the surveillance maps. He looked at the men who had allowed his savior to be cast into the mud. A woman with no name and no record pulled me back from a place none of you had the courage to enter, Do-Hyum said, his voice carrying the texture of iron being drawn across stone. My family treated her like refuse and threw her into a storm while I lay frozen. You watched it happen. You permitted the erasure of the only hand that wasn't trying to steal my crown. The lead enforcer began to speak of the difficulties of the scrubbed logs and the lack of digital traces, but Do-Hyum silenced him with a single sharp motion. He wasn't interested in the logistics of failure. I am not interested in the limits of your systems, Do-Hyum commanded, the fire in his eyes narrowing into a cold, absolute focus. I am interested in the debt I owe. She is out there, alone, with a target on her back because she chose to save a man the world had already buried. He checked his watch, the rhythmic ticking the only sound in the suffocating stillness. You have 24 hours, he said, the ultimatum landing with the weight of an irreversible sentence. Turn over every stone in this city. Audit every unofficial clinic, every transit hub, every shadow where the invisible people hide. If she is not found within the window, I will consider the loyalty of this organization to be as dead as the family believed I was. Do not come back to me with excuses. Come back to me with her location or do not come back at all. He turned his back on them, looking out at the rain-streaked glass, a hunter who had already decided that the world would burn until the woman named Deby was safe. The time for being gracious was over. The resurrection was now a hunt, and the reckoning would be absolute. The rain had finally tapered off into a cold, clinging mist that hung over the coastal town like a shroud. Deby stepped off the last bus of the night, her boots echoing with a lonely, hollow sound against the damp pavement. She moved with a quiet, upright caution, her eyes constantly scanning the shifting shapes of the fog. She was no longer the woman who sang in a penthouse of betrayal. She was a nameless traveler in a world that demanded her silence. The small bag she clutched to her chest felt heavier than it ever had, a leaden weight containing the golden needle and the remnants of a life she had been forced to bury. She reached the entrance of a narrow 3-story apartment building tucked into the shadows of a crumbling alleyway. It was a place where people came to disappear, where the ledgers were thin and the questions were few. As she fumbled with the rusted key, her mind returned to the man she had pulled back from the dark. She wondered if Kwan Do-Hyum was truly awake, or if the vultures had succeeded in reclaiming the throne she had tried to save for him. She felt the sharp sting of an injustice that had no name, a savior cast into the mud while the traitors sat in silk chairs. She pushed the door open, the hinges giving a long, mournful groan that seemed to signal the end of her journey. But as she stepped into the dim yellow light of the hallway, a sudden coldness that had nothing to do with the weather settled in the small of her back. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The air in the alleyway had changed, the rhythm of the night interrupted by a presence that was intentional and absolute. Across the street, parked deep within the mouth of a dark service lane, a black sedan sat with its engine silent and its lights extinguished. Behind the tinted glass, a pair of eyes watched her with the steady focus of a man who had already decided the outcome of the night. A phone glowed briefly in the dark interior of the car, a sharp blue light reflecting off a surveillance image of the woman in the doorway. Deby felt the skin on her neck tighten, the old iron in her soul rising to meet a threat she could not see. She stepped inside and closed the door, the heavy bolt sliding home with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. She believed she was safe behind the wood and the iron, unaware that the blackmailers had never lost her trail. Outside, the black car remained, a silent sentinel in the mist. The hunt was no longer moving in rhythmic circles. It had arrived at her door, and the reckoning was closer than the breath in her lungs. Will Do-Hyum finally meet the woman who saved his life? Stay tuned for episode 2.